Southern Italy. August. The plain near the village of Cannae. If you could rise above that field, you would see bodies. Tens of thousands of bodies. They weren't lying in rows, but in piles. Packed tightly, one on top of another, 3 layers deep. Weapons were scattered everywhere, but not Carthaginian ones. Roman. Shields, swords, spears, crested helmets. All Roman. And the bodies, also Roman. No one was clearing them, because there was no one left to do it. 80,000 men marched onto that field in the morning. By sunset, 50 to 70,000 of them lay dead. It wasn't the Romans who annihilated someone. It was the Romans who were annihilated. The most devastating defeat in the entire history of Rome, in a single day. This is Cannae, August 2nd, 216 BC. And today, we won't analyze this day like a textbook, not as a recitation of dates and arrows on a map. We'll break down how one man, with an army half the size, trapped the Romans in an inescapable snare. We'll explore why Rome knew it was taking a risk, and went ahead anyway. What encirclement looks like from the inside, through the eyes of a legionary unable to even lift his sword. And most importantly, why Rome didn't surrender after this slaughter, but grew stronger. And the man who orchestrated it stood on a nearby hill, watching the most powerful army of the ancient world burn itself out. That man was Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian. By the summer of 216 BCE, he had already been ravaging Italy for 2 years. He had crossed the Alps, losing half his army and all but one of his elephants. Yet, he still began to win. At Ticinus, he crushed the Roman cavalry. At Trebia, he lured 2 legions into an ambush by the river in midwinter. At Lake Trasimene, he annihilated an entire consular army in the fog. Approximately 50,000 Romans in just 2 battles. Rome was accustomed to victory. Rome had built a system that ground down any opponent. But here, the system wasn't working. Hannibal struck repeatedly, each time with a new approach. And then Rome decided, enough. Gather everything they had. Overwhelm him with sheer numbers, once and for all. This decision would kill 70,000 people in one day. But Rome didn't know that yet. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Not military, but political. Rome appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus. The man proved smarter than everyone else. He understood that fighting Hannibal in an open field was impossible. They needed to wear him down, cut off his supplies, wait, avoid a general engagement. This strategy became known as the Fabian strategy. And it worked. Hannibal plundered fields, burned villages, provoked, while Fabius followed close behind him, refusing to engage in battle. Clever, wasn't it? Yes. But Rome wasn't one man. Rome was the Senate, and the Senate found patience difficult. Every month of inaction looked like cowardice. Every burned village felt like a personal insult. And when Fabius's term expired, the Senate elected 2 new consuls. 2. With one mission: find Hannibal and destroy him. Now hold on. Let me explain why this decision was not just bold, but almost suicidal. Rome had assembled about 80,000 men. 80,000. That's like a stadium. A large stadium, packed with men in armor, carrying swords, shields, and spears. Half of them were raw recruits who had never seen real combat. This massive force was commanded by 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. They alternated command. One day, one commanded, the next day, the other. And here's the crucial point. They couldn't stand each other. Paulus was an aristocrat, cautious, and remembered the lessons of Lake Trasimene. Varro was a man of the people, aggressive, eager for battle. 2 generals with opposing temperaments who switched command every other day at the head of a gigantic army marching against the greatest tactician of their time. Can you already feel where this is going? Meanwhile, Hannibal had occupied Cannae, a grain depot in Apulia, southern Italy. Not by chance. He knew that Rome depended on this grain. To surrender the depot without a fight would mean showing allies that Rome was weak. Not to surrender would mean accepting battle on Hannibal's terms. A trap. A classic trap where the victim walks right into the predator's jaws. And Rome came. The two consuls led their army to Cannae. They set up camp a few miles away. 80,000 men. And one night before the bloodiest day in Roman history. August 2nd. Morning. It was Varro's day to command, and he wanted to fight. Paulus was against it, but protocol was protocol. The army lined up on the plain south of the Aufidus River. And here's the first thing Hannibal did. Even before the first sword struck, he positioned his troops facing north. This meant the Romans were facing south. And from the south, in early August, the Libeccio wind blows. A dry, hot wind that carries dust directly into their eyes. A minor detail? Not when 130,000 men are fighting on a scorching plain. And that was just the first of Hannibal's tricks that day. Not even the main one. Now, the formation. And here, Hannibal's genius is crystal clear. The Romans did what Romans always did. Placed their infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks. But this time, they made their formation deeper than usual. The idea was simple. To break through the center with sheer mass. 70,000 infantrymen packed into a dense column. A wall of shields and swords that was supposed to cut through any opponent like a fist through paper. Hannibal was waiting for exactly this. His center. Gauls and Spaniards, his least reliable troops. He pushed forward in a crescent shape, convex towards the Romans. And on the sides of the center, slightly behind, in a staggered formation, he placed his Libyan infantry, his best, fresh, wearing armor taken from dead Romans, cavalry, Numidian and Spanish, on the flanks. The trap was set. All that remained was to wait for the victim to walk into it. And the battle began. The Roman infantry struck the center, and the center began to bend. The Gauls and Spaniards retreated, slowly, step by step. The Romans pressed forward. Hannibal's formation transformed from a convex crescent into a straight line, then into a concave one. The Romans were drawn deeper and deeper, like a fist sinking into a cushion, and the deeper they advanced, the narrower their front became. The denser they packed together, the less room they had to maneuver. Meanwhile, the Libyan infantry on the sides, they stood still. They waited. They didn't move. And now, for a second, this is what it looked like from the inside. A legionary somewhere in the middle of the formation. In front of him, the backs of his comrades. Behind him, his own men pushing. To his right and left, shoulder to shoulder. He could see nothing but helmets, dust, and the sky. He couldn't raise his sword. It was that crowded. Hot. Sand flew into his eyes. Shouts. But it was impossible to tell where they came from. What was happening? Unknown. Only one thing was certain. They were pushing forward, they were pushing back, and the space around him was shrinking with every passing second. And on the flanks, at that very moment, what Hannibal had planned all along took place. The Numidian and Spanish cavalry crushed the Roman horsemen. 6,000 Roman cavalry against 10,000. The outcome was predictable. The Roman cavalry fled, and the Carthaginian cavalry, instead of pursuing, turned, and struck the Roman infantry's rear. Simultaneously, the Libyan infantry on the sides, which had been waiting for this moment, closed in. The ring was complete. 80,000 men found themselves in a pocket, surrounded from all sides. And this is where the part that textbooks usually skim over in a single line begins. And it is the most horrific, because the ring closed, but the battle didn't end. The surrounded Romans did not surrender. They had nowhere to surrender. In the crush, you couldn't raise your hands. They continued to stand, packed into a mass, while the Carthaginians began methodically, from the edges, to kill. Hour after hour. Livy would later write that dead men were found with their heads buried in the ground. They had dug holes themselves and suffocated because it seemed better than waiting. Live men were found with their leg tendons severed. They couldn't stand, but offered their throats, begged to be finished. This wasn't a battle. It was an assembly line of death. About 100 Romans perished every minute at the peak of the slaughter. By sunset, according to various estimates, 50 to 70,000 bodies lay on the plain near Cannae. Consul Paulus, dead. 29 of 48 military tribunes, dead. About 80 senators and former senators, dead. This wasn't just an army. This was the political elite of Rome, annihilated in a single August day. Hannibal lost about 6,000 men. Of those, 4,000 were Gauls who held the center, those who absorbed the blow of the Roman fist and didn't flee. Hannibal knew they would die. He had planned to sacrifice them in advance. Wait, this, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable moment in the entire story. We are accustomed to admiring tactical genius. The Cannae maneuver is still studied in military academies. Schlieffen based his plan for World War I on it. Eisenhower called it a classic example of a battle of annihilation. But Hannibal's tactical genius meant this. He had pre-planned the death of 4,000 of his own soldiers as part of the trap. The Gauls and Spaniards in the center were bait, living bait, who were not told they were bait. And here, a turning point that would later become legend. After the battle, Maharbal, commander of the Numidian cavalry, approached Hannibal. According to Livy, he said, "In 5 days, you will feast on the capital. Send the cavalry ahead. The Romans will know you have arrived before they know you are coming." Hannibal refused. The army was tired. They needed rest. There were no siege engines. And Maharbal replied with a phrase that would be quoted for 2,000 years. "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you do not know how to make use of your victory." Honestly, most likely this conversation is a fabrication, a Roman fabrication, characteristically. The historian Polybius, who lived closer to the events and was more accurate than Livy, doesn't mention Maharbal at Cannae at all. The phrase about feasting on the capital is purely Roman. That's how triumphant generals feasted. How would a Numidian cavalryman know that custom? And from Cannae to Rome is about 400 kilometers. In 5 days, even for cavalry, it's unrealistic. But the myth stuck. Because it's convenient. It allows Rome to say, "We didn't lose the war. We just got lucky." Hannibal himself missed his chance. And now, the most astonishing part. Rome received the news. Panic gripped the city. Women flocked to the temples. Senators demanded answers. Rumors circulated that Hannibal was marching on Rome. And do you know what the Senate did? It refused to negotiate. Hannibal sent an embassy, offered to ransom prisoners, discuss peace terms. The Senate wouldn't listen. Moreover, it made a decision that sends shivers down the spine. Not to ransom the prisoners. Not a single one. 20,000 Roman citizens in Hannibal's hands. And the Senate said, "No, we do not pay for those who surrendered." This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a message. To Hannibal, to their allies, to themselves. Rome does not bargain after defeat. Rome builds a new army. And within a month after Cannae, Rome raised 4 new legions. Recruited slaves, criminals, teenagers, forged an army from them, not to fight in an open field again. But to return to Fabius's strategy, the very one they had considered cowardly a year ago. It turned out, cowardice is when it works. That is the true lesson of Cannae. Not in Hannibal's genius, though it is undisputed. The lesson is in what happened afterward. Any other ancient state, after such a blow, would have surrendered. Carthage surrendered to Regulus after far fewer losses. Macedon surrendered after 1 lost battle. But Rome lost 1/5 of its adult male population, and responded, no. Hannibal would then spend 13 more years in Italy. He would win almost every skirmish. He would sway allies. But Rome would never give him another major battle. Never. And Rome would win this war. Slowly. Tediously. Through logistics and diplomacy. Through a strategy once called cowardice. And then called brilliant. Hannibal won the battle. But he lost the war. And this perhaps is the main irony of the entire story. Perfect tactics are nothing against a system that refuses to die. Maharbal perhaps was right. Or not. We will never know. But one thing we know for sure. Rome, after Cannae, did not become weaker. It became fiercer. And 14 years later, Scipio would use Hannibal's tactics against Hannibal himself at Zama, and Carthage would lose. And 60 years later, Rome would return to Carthage and wipe it from the face of the earth. Sow the earth with salt, so that nothing, ever, would grow again. Rome did not forget. Hannibal won the battle, but he lost the war. Why? We will analyze in detail. But first, something completely different. Tomorrow, the pyramids. No aliens, but with engineers who knew physics better than many of ours.